Now we see another type of bean, that is message driven bean. Now, message driven bean is a bean that acts as an asynchronous message consumer. Now, what do you mean by asynchronous message consumer? It will reply to the messages. It will receive a message, depending upon what the message is, it will reply to it. Asynchronous means that the sender and the receiver need not wait for each other. So the sender sends the message, it does not wait for the receiver to receive or process the message. The receiver will process the message as per its own convenience. So it is asynchronous. Now, message driven bean does not have any client specific state. It will handle the messages, which will, either open the database connection or do some task or create some object references for another EJB. It may do multiple things, but it will not maintain any client state. Now, the client uses a message driven bean to send messages to the destination for which message bean is a listener. So, message bean will listen to the messages and act accordingly. Message driven bean, they are stateless, they do not maintain any client state. They are server side. Obviously, it is a EJB, has to be server side. And they are transaction aware components that can process asynchronous JMS messages. Now, what is JMS? JMS is Java Message Service. It is Java Message Service. Now, message driven beans will receive the messages from JMS queue or a topic, and it will perform some business logic, or it will execute some business logic based on the content of the message. Okay. Now, EJB deployers, they will create listeners to the queue or a topic, and the server will automatically create or remove the message driven bean instances as needed to process the incoming messages. So suppose the incoming messages are more instances may be created. Okay. Listeners means, they keep on listening for something. So in our case, they will be listening for JMS messages. Now, as I already explained to you, message driven bean will allow your Java EE applications to receive the JMS messages asynchronously. Asynchronous means what? The sender and receiver may not depend on each other. Now, there are certain characteristics of message driven bean. They are components that receive inbound messages from whom? JMS provider. What is JMS? As I told you earlier, it is Java Message Service. They process the messages that they receive. The business logic for handling the received messages may include something like some calculation, some computation, or some step in a workflow, storing data into the database, retrieving data from the database, sending another message, transferring data to another EJB for further processing. Okay, n number of possibilities are there. As message listeners, consuming messages from the JMS destination such as queue or a topic, that we have discussed earlier also, that there is a queue, there is a topic, and your message driven bean will consume or take the messages from these queue or topic. Now they may invoke another EJB to get some help. Message driven bean instances do not retain any data or any conversational state that is client specific, indicating that they are stateless. Now, a single message driven bean can process messages from multiple clients. And how are they invoked? They are invoked asynchronously. As discussed earlier, they are transaction aware. Now, message driven beans are not capable of representing the data in the database. They do not represent the data in the database, but they can access the data in the database. Okay, so if I want to retrieve the data, I want to update the data, I want to insert the data into the database, that can be done via message driven bean. Okay. Now, message driven bean does not have its interfaces because clients do not access the message driven bean through the interfaces. Now, remote and local interfaces are not there for client access. So how will The client accesses the message driven bean by sending an JMS message, for which the bean is the listener. So bean will listen to that message and act accordingly. So no need of local or remote interfaces. Now, message driven beans are quite similar to the stateless session beans because they are short lived, they do not retain any client specific state, and they may have several instances that are running at the same time. When I'll use message driven beans? When I want to have asynchronous messaging in my application, uh, when I need to have the messages which are automatically delivered, I want to integrate two applications in a loosely coupled but reliable manner. The two applications should be able to communicate with each other. And I want to create a message selector. Now, what is a message selector? Message selector is it is something that will react only to specific messages. So you may use message driven beans as triggers also. Now, message driven bean works as consumer of messages. This is another question that can be asked. See, in message driven bean, lots of questions can be asked. And whatever content is covered in this video, you will practically be able to answer any question that is related to message driven bean with help of this content. Now, as I already told you, message driven bean acts as a message consumer in JMS messaging system. It will receive the messages from either the JMS queue or the topic, and it will act on the message. Now, EJB deployers will create listeners to this queue or topic at deployment time. And it is the server's responsibility to automatically create or remove the message driven bean instances, depending upon the volume of the incoming messages. Now, these messages are received asynchronously. Now, who can send the messages? A Java client may send the messages, another EJB may send the messages, a JSP may send the messages, or even a normal Java application, that is non-Java EE application, can also send the messages. Now, the client who is sending the messages may not be aware about where that message driven bean is. MDB is nothing but message driven bean. Okay, but what is the requirement? The message must be as per the JMS specifications. I repeat, what is JMS? Java Message Service. Now, any message driven bean that you create should have following requirements. It should meet following requirements. So, what are the requirements? It must implement the message listener interface for the message type it is going to support. So, there are 5 different JMS message types. A bean that supports the JMS API must implement javax.jms.messageListener. Okay, now you have two options. You can either annotate the message driven bean class with @message driven, or you can make the entry in the deployment descriptor. So it is up to you what you want to do. Next thing is the class that you are using as a message driven bean class, it should be public. It cannot be abstract or final, and it must have a public constructor without any arguments. And it cannot define the finalize method. Now, one method that your class should override is the onMessage method. And in case you want to override any lifecycle methods like @postConstruct or @predestroy methods, you can do that, but that is not compulsory. But whatever your business logic is there, that must be there in the onMessage method. Now, if you need any helper methods, you can define those helper methods also, and those helper methods will be called inside the onMessage method. So this is just a small snippet of code. You are having an onMessage method which I have overridden. It takes an object of message, and then depending on the message, I am just calling another method. Now, what is the life cycle of the message driven bean, and what is the working, or what are the things that are done in the onMessage method? That is what we are going to see. Now if you see this life cycle, you will find this life cycle that is very similar to the stateless bean. The only change is this on message method. So does not exist and ready are the two states. Okay, now EJB container will usually create a pool of message driven bean instances, just as pool of beans is created in stateless session beans. Similarly, the pool of beans is created here. Any dependency injection that is there is inserted. If there is any method which is annotated with @post construct, that method is called by the container. And once this is done, your message driven bean is in the ready state. It is ready to process the messages. Now from where the messages are going to come? The messages are going to come from either a JMS queue or a JMS topic. Now depending upon the messages received, for every message the on message method will be called. The on message method has the business logic to tackle the messages. It will it will generate the reply depending on that business logic. And then when everything is done and you want to destroy and you want to go for garbage collection, from ready state you will call the method which is annotated with @predestroy. Now once this method has been called, the bean is ready for garbage collection, and again we come back to does not exist state. So this is the life cycle of message driven bean. The explanation is again given in the notes. Now again we come to on message method. Now if you see this, you can see that many points are repeated, but let us have a look at it quickly. In message driven bean, either you can use the annotation as @message driven, or you can include the things in deployment descriptor. Okay, now the bean class should implement the message listener interface, where we are having a method called as onMessage. Now this onMessage method should take the argument of javax.jms.message. Okay, we have seen that in the code above. Now every message driven bean has to be associated with some JMS destination. It is either a queue or it is a topic for publish subscribe. So queue is nothing but for point-to-point messaging. Okay, now onMessage method is activated when a message is sent by the client application to the corresponding JMS destination. Now it is the developer's duty to implement the onMessage method for that message driven bean. So message aane pe kya karna hai, what has to be done upon receiving the message, that business logic has to be written in the onMessage method. Now as I told you earlier also, onMessage method may call other helper methods, or it can also invoke a session bean that will process the information in the message, or it can also store the things into the database or retrieve the things from the database. Now, how does the working take place? So message driven bean is a bean that contains business logic, but it is invoked by passing of the messages. So you don't invoke a message driven bean by calling the local or the remote interface. You invoke the message driven bean by passing on the messages. It handles the messages asynchronously. It picks up the messages from a JMS queue or a JMS topic. Okay. Now Java Message Service is an API that will facilitate, or that will give you facilities to create, send or read the messages. So whenever you want to establish some kind of loosely coupled but reliable asynchronous communication, you can always use the services of JMS. So as you can see over here, the application client sends the messages. The messages are stored in the queue, and then these messages are delivered to the message driven bean instances. MDB is nothing but message driven bean instances. As we all know, we have Java EE server on which we have different types of containers. So here obviously we are working with EJB, so there's a EJB container, and inside EJB container you have message driven bean instances. Okay, and a message driven bean, just like your stateless session bean, It encapsulates the business logic, but it does not maintain any client specific state. So this is the complete answer for message driven bean. Any question on message driven bean can be answered with help of points covered in this video. Thank you.